My Combat Control Training Experience, Chapter 8, Air Traffic Control School, Keesler Air Force Base, Biloxi, Mississippi. Air Traffic Control School, one of the core duties to master as a combat controller, was my next challenge. After growing gills underwater, being beaten in a POW camp, and then jumping out of airplanes, Air Traffic Control School, or ATC, was my next focus. Learning ATC was a huge challenge on its own, but learning it in the military had its own special challenges. Mostly the fire hose of information thrown at us while being beaten physically every morning. I was not a fast learner in the books, so I could tell it was going to be an academic challenge. It was hard for me to put the academic pieces together when I never even thought about applying any of it, but that was the process. The part was learning all the information about ATC, which is a lot, before doing the practical application on simulators. I learned by doing, so the first part was a struggle for me. The course was 4 weeks of academics, and then we moved on to simulators. It was the same course that the Air Force sent all students who had the job of ATC. It was a full day of mental challenges, but for the combat controllers, the day started around 4 a.m. and involved running around the base in the dark, carrying the team rock, working out in the gym, going on long rucksack marches, doing kettlebells, riding stationary bikes, and swimming in the outdoor pool and ocean before an 8-hour classroom day. The physical goal of the course, which took about 15 weeks to complete, was to build us up into peak physical shape before they tore us down at Combat Control School. The team rock was the heaviest at Keesler. We had one in each phase of training, but it was especially heavy at ATC school. Each team was required to get a rock and paint it however they wanted. In that school, it had to be extra large. Most teams did something with the lightning bolt, which was part of the logo on the Scarlet Beret. Ours was the same, painted black with a lightning bolt, and never quit, along with other words of motivation. The rock probably weighed about 30 pounds, and it was passed around the team as we ran on the team runs, and we sang in the dark. Some guys struggled and fell behind, but I did well with it. Thankfully, running was my strong suit, and I never had to worry much about it, or the rock. I already felt over my head in the classroom portion of the course on an early morning in November, but I had no time to worry about it by the outdoor pool. It was in Mississippi, but it was still cold in the mornings, too cold to be swimming in the pool without a wetsuit. We were ordered into the pool to swim a mile with fins on. "Into the water!" the instructor shouted, but I hesitated, just like jumping out of an airplane. That seemed to be a common theme. I would hesitate until everybody else started to do it. That water was ice cold. The water felt like knives cutting into my skin. I took it 1 minute at a time. At the end, we had to stay in the pool to wait for everyone to finish. After shivering for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the last cone to finish his laps in the pool, it didn't pay to be a winner that time. The instructor shouted, "Nut to butt, let's go!" We were allowed to get close to each other to warm up our body on the pool edge. I got as close to the guy in front of me as I could. His lips were blue and he was violently shaking, but I hardly noticed. I looked forward to every other Friday that was an early release day. All the classes got out early in the morning. Of course, the combat controllers took advantage of this time for even more physical activity. We would go on a ruck march after classes let out. After the ruck, we would head over to an obstacle course with different events made to test physical endurance, balance, and agility. There were cargo nets to climb over, low barbed wire to crawl under, and one obstacle called the Dirty Name. I hated the Dirty Name because you had to jump to different horizontal telephone poles, each one spaced conveniently too far apart, like a Mario Brothers game. And you had to land with your chest and climb up to stand. We would do the obstacle course a couple times through, which left your body smoked. Then we would do the obstacle course again with a 75-pound rucksack on. It was almost impossible to climb over the 50-foot tall cargo net and climb ropes with all that shit on your back. After that, we would get on our knees and spar with each other, practicing different fighting moves, trying to force each other into submission. I was in the best shape of my life. The rucks were fast and intense. They were a big step up from the orientation course that caused many guys to drop out. The ATC ruck pace was insane because the instructors who were in the best shape were staffed at the ATC course. I hated to go on ruck marches, yet that was one of the core skills of a combat controller. As bad as they sucked, I always loved the feeling of getting them done. I absolutely dreaded them because it was one of the few events that I felt like one of the weaker performers. Getting through the intense rucks and going back to the barracks, and then throwing a huge wad of dip in my mouth, made me feel on top of the world. I transitioned from Red Man to dip immediately after survival school. I became addicted to the combination of doing intense physical activities, followed up with a large wad of dip. We had just gotten back from an intense morning workout session. Instead of the usual Tuesday easy 6-mile run with the rock, and then doing circuit training with weights, the instructors took us to the beach with our BDUs and rucksacks on. The base being near Biloxi meant we were a few miles from the Gulf Coast beaches. The natural landscape of the beach was used as a gut check for us. The early morning drive on the bus was quiet. I was deep in thought. My anxiety and quiet moments seemed to ramp up a lot more during this intense phase of training, because the academic and physical standards were becoming much more intense. We had an academic test later that morning on all the ATC academic information we covered up to that point. It was a type of test I was weak at, a test on memorizing all the information of the complex skill of controlling aircraft, with terms like nav aids, PIREPs, touch and go, and downwinds, but I had no idea how it would tie together in a practical sense. They basically told us all the terms and in-depth information about air traffic without me being able to apply any of it. It made little sense at the time, like a foreign language, and having to figure it all out, how it fit together, was a huge challenge for me, especially being physically exhausted the entire course. I seemed to be one step behind each day because the pace never let up. Out on a beach that looked like a war zone, Hurricane Katrina had slammed that area a few months earlier. We had the heaviest weight that I'd ever felt in my life in our rucksacks. The rucks weighed exactly 80 pounds, no more, no less, and they had to be exact. I wouldn't dare try to cheat it. We unloaded onto the beach in the dark for a 2-hour smoke session, while we lugged around the heavy rucks in our field BDUs. Normally, I liked being on the beach, but that morning was different. Besides the ocean water being brown and dirty looking because of the proximity to the Mississippi River, the whole area, casinos and beach line, was ravaged by the recent storm. There was trash along the beach and surrounding area, and the whole area was nearly abandoned. It wasn't like I'd heard from previous classes enjoying the nightlife in the clubs and casinos in nearby Biloxi. It was just a shell of its former self, and in the stages of a long process of rebuilding. On top of all that, it was winter, so the brown ocean water was even more unappealing. I began to lie down in the water with my rucksack beside an old wash machine that was probably from a house that was flooded during the hurricane. The water seemed even colder than the outdoor pool we swam in. As a small wave rushed over us, the cold water shocked me. It didn't take long to warm up, as we were soon bear crawling around the debris in the sand along the beach, trying not to be last. We went from one event to the next for a few hours. After bear crawling, we did wheelbarrow races. First me holding someone's legs and trying to adjust the heavy weight on my back, to someone holding my feet and I was running with my arms, as they went numb trying to summon up every ounce of strength to continue with the weight on my back. As the sun came up, the ugly beach came into full view. As I ran with a teammate on my back, that felt way too heavy. Our gear soaked and full of sand, I ran with all my gear carrying the dead weight of another cone and all his gear. I could barely move as I heard a shout. "Hurry up! You won't survive combat control school!" None of us ever went fast enough. We stayed in the leaning rests, barely able to keep our back straight, and when we could no longer stay up, we log rolled with heavy rucksacks full of metal weights, while the beach and all the junk began spinning around like I was drunk. "You all are pathetic! You'll never make it!" After getting through the academic portion with a test at the end, we quickly moved into the simulators for the practical portion. The pace continued as we moved into talking to actual airplanes on a simulator. In the giant simulators that resembled the inside of a control tower, we began applying knowledge from the previous week by trying to move simulated traffic around the make-believe airport. We were surrounded 180 degrees by big screens. Each one resembled a window in a tower cab. When we saw a plane flying through the air on one of the screens, it went to the next one, while the pilot talked to us in a robotic voice using phraseology learned in academics. Actually seeing planes move around, speaking to them properly, and watching them do as instructed, or not, made me realize the difficult nature of ATC. The scenarios got busier every day. Just as I got used to moving aircraft in the air and on the ground, more planes were added. The runways were turned around, nighttime operations were conducted, and different weather was introduced with the click of a mouse. It kept me feeling behind the learning curve. At the end of the 15-week course, at the completion of the practical phase, we had practical tests. 3 simulator tests to see if we had the skills necessary to obtain ratings in a control tower. On the first test, after getting physically smoked that morning, I was nervous about the final evaluations. We each took a turn running a ground control and then a tower test run, and like the academic portion, I didn't feel anywhere close to being ready. On the practice runs, the ATC instructors fed me instructions often, and I just did what they told me to do. The planes fit together, but I was unsure if I could do it on my own. On Blues Monday, I was dressed in my dress blue uniform, ready to give the practical test a shot. I was nervous as the first aircraft checked in for landing. The first Cessna was inbound to the make-believe airport for a full-stop landing. I cleared the first few jets for takeoff, remembering the correct words, and the aircraft seemed to be reading back my instructions correctly. After getting a few more Cessna 172s in the VFR pattern, an A-10 checked in for the overhead brake. My departures were piling up, ready for departure at the runway. But I didn't even notice the ground controller taxiing them out because I was trying to sort out who was who in the pattern and where. With a couple of Cessnas and a C-130 circling around in my VFR pattern, I began to lose the picture of what was going on. One of the Cessnas flew out of my airspace without me even noticing. At that point, I had completely lost track of who was where, and I had no idea what was going on. The instructor stepped in and stopped the test. I had failed. That same feeling of disappointment I felt after I broke my leg had returned. I hoped for a retest, but I was probably going to be set back. I messed up the test so much the instructors recommended that I take the entire practical portion again. I'd have to wait for another class to come through so I could try again with them. If they even kept me in, this would be my 3rd setback. I didn't take failure well at the time, and I just hoped that I could keep whatever motivation I had to continue on. What kind of concerned me was, unlike the first academic test, I actually applied myself in the simulators. But I still did not catch on quick enough. Some people catch on to ATC faster than others, but some never catch on at all. It's one of those skills not everyone could do, but I knew I could do it if I had enough time. I was sure of it. Just like the orientation course in Jump Week at Airborne School, I did the practical part of ATC again with another class after watching everyone else I'd gotten to know move on without me. I sat around and waited at Keesler Air Force Base and continued to work out, clean the barracks, and kill time until my new team arrived out of academics. It was a nice break, but I grew restless sitting around thinking about the practical test I had to take over and combat control school. It was becoming more difficult to be a motivated cone. I still hadn't learned my lesson from the fight during the orientation course because I almost got into more trouble toward the end of my 2nd round of ATC testing. When I rolled back to my new team, I met Sergeant Perth, who was one of our team's NCOs. He was a stocky, muscular guy that had bright blonde hair that he spiked up in front. I understood what kind of guy Sergeant Perth was, but it didn't stop me from hanging out with him. He was a former TAC-P who wanted to cross-train to become a combat controller, and seemed to like using the title to impress people, especially women. It's what made me enjoy hanging out with him. He was ridiculous to the point of being entertaining, and had no problem telling women at bars that we were special ops. The instructors were on to him during the last part of our ATC class, and suggested that he should return back to TAC-P where he belonged. With the type of training we were doing, it was hard to hide who we were, as our true personalities were exposed in the intense training. It was even more clear that Sergeant Perth wanted the beret for recognition and attention, the exact opposite of what the combat control community was all about. Sergeant Perth was quickly gone during Hell Week at Combat Control School. But at Keesler, there was a curfew at midnight that had been in place for years because of the trouble former cones had gotten into at casinos. But they were all shut down at the time because of the hurricane damage. But Sergeant Perth and I still found places like Chili's to hang out and drink. Despite all that, I still went out to bars to hang out well past curfew and try to pick up women with Sergeant Perth, many times staying out until 3 or 4 in the morning before rushing back to the barracks. The curfew was 11 o'clock during the week and midnight on the weekends. I met more women than I would have without him because he loved to talk about himself in CCT, especially to women who would listen. He drove a Ford Mustang and bragged about his Ducati motorcycle. He was certainly more about the image of being a combat controller than actually being one. But he was still fun to hang around with because he encouraged me to talk to women that were checking me out in the bars. "Come on, man. You're a physical stud. Go over there and talk to her." As Sergeant Perth and I tried to sneak back into the barracks on a Friday night around 2 o'clock in the morning, we were still drunk. That's when I met Captain Fredericks, a man that would become my team captain and enemy later on during combat control school. Captain Fredericks was a short-statured guy with a darker complexion, along with black hair and dark beady eyes. I'm pretty sure he had a short man complex and overcompensated with his physical fitness because he could beat me at everything, and I was very good at push-ups, pull-ups, and running. Very few people could beat me at all three, but he could. Captain Fredericks had just arrived in a class that was beginning the 15-week course, as Perth and I were sneaking back and breaking curfew again and trying to sneak back into my room during a random surprise room inspection by the instructors. As I made my way into the barracks, the place was full of activity, not dark and quiet like I'd expected. And I didn't want to get caught again. A few weeks earlier, we drove back on base in Sergeant Perth's Mustang and saw our team outside of the barracks getting smoked by the instructors. Sergeant Perth and I just looked at each other for a moment. Then we got out of the car to join the team in our clothes, still drunk and smelling like bar smoke. "Glad you could join us, guys," an instructor shouted. We never heard anything else about it. That time, we made it back into the barracks as the inspection was beginning. All the teams at the schoolhouse were beginning to stand outside their rooms for the inspections. When I heard the instructor's voice, just out of view around the corner of the hallway, I stopped and froze. As I turned down the hallway the other way, out of the view of the instructors, I saw Captain Fredericks watching me, but I had no idea he was a captain or the team leader of the new class. He was wearing PT sweats that only had his name stenciled on the front of his sweatshirt. Captain Fredericks was looking out the doorway like there was a car accident outside of his house in a residential neighborhood. As Perth and I walked past Captain Fredericks' room, we saw him standing in the doorway. "What's going on?" Sergeant Perth frantically asked Captain Fredericks. "Two guys aren't here," Captain Fredericks said. "The instructors are looking for them." Captain Fredericks said. "Have they been down our side yet?" Sergeant Perth asked. "I don't know," Captain Fredericks said. Captain Fredericks looked at us with suspicion. We both smelled like booze and were dressed in nice clothes at 2 o'clock in the morning. Perth started smiling and asked, "Hey, if anyone asked, tell them you saw us tonight, okay?" "I don't know, man," Fredericks said, shaking his head, looking down. "Come on, man," Perth insisted. Frederick just kept repeating, I don't know, man." "We need you, man," Sergeant Perth said, laughing, as he placed his hand on Captain Frederick's shoulder. Captain Fredericks looked down at the floor and slowly shook his head. "I just don't know," he said again quietly. "Whatever, dude," Sergeant Perth said, as we turned and snuck back to our rooms to change our clothes. That first meeting with Captain Fredericks was the beginning of a dysfunctional relationship that I would develop later at combat control school with him. I'm not sure if Captain Fredericks said anything about seeing us sneak in, but as I got on my PT sweats, everything got quiet. "Back in your rooms!" I heard an instructor shout. We went to bed that night without any further inspections or harassment. It was strange. Before we left the course, we were informed the curfew had been lifted for future cones. And that left me even more confused, but I didn't ask any questions about it. Despite all my extracurricular activities during the course with the new team, I finished a practical test at the top of the class. I knew it just took me more time than others to figure stuff out, but once I did, I became really good at it. Another strange event that happened at the end was we were supposed to take 3 simulator tests to finish the course. The simulators broke down that day and we only got through the first one. But they told us we all passed and we moved on. Again, I didn't ask any questions and I was just thankful to be done with that school.